Thank you. So I'm going to discuss one site in southern England where I've been working for 6 years. Not as long as Colin Morris, but we have an interesting study anyway. So Wytham Woods, the name Wytham actually refers to an Anglo-Saxon term for a bend or a loop in the river. So the woodland is on a hill, and this is the Thames, so halfway between where the Thames begins and London. And there are also streams, tributaries, and meadows, and a large reservoir. So on 3 sides, this woodland has a lot of water, which is good for bats. You can see the woodland slightly more clearly on the aerial picture, and here's the reservoir, and here is some unimproved meadow, but the rest of the land is fairly mixed, grassland and arable, fairly intensively farmed. The woodland itself is nothing particularly special. There are some veteran trees, but most of the trees are not 150 years old. There is oak, so Quercus robur, ash, Fraxinus excelsior, and also some plantations, beech, Fagus sylvatica, sweet chestnut, you'll have to help me with that, and even some pine, but it's mixed. So it's a very varied compartment. There is no easy generalization for the habitat, the different woodland across the hill. And this is a map of the boxes. So every grey dot you see there is a Schregler box. And we have 1,265 boxes. So keeps me busy. Well, but now I must explain, these are not bat boxes. These are bird boxes. So I don't know the code, I only know the bat codes. These are smaller the boxes for birds. And the Edward Gray Institute manages this as a study for great tits, Paris major, and blue tit. Also, you have to help me with the Latin because it's changed. But the woodland is owned by Oxford University, and since 1947, there have been boxes ever increasing until the 70s of boxes, and this was established by David Lack, but only, and it's quite fitting, after he visited the Netherlands. And I don't know if either of these names mean anything to anybody. And it was they visited this site. Hopefully this means something to somebody also. And boxes were put up in 1912. And after he visited this site, he saw that this was really a good way to study tits. Previously, he had planned to study robins, but was converted by the idea. And the original boxes that were put up, the idea was that these birds might help control the winter moth, which is a forestry pest. I don't think they really proved that the birds do control the moth populations, but maybe if bats are using these boxes, it could come full circle, which would be kind of fun. So in the until the 1970s, these were small wooden boxes. Somebody in one of the first presentations had the pictures of the typical small wooden boxes, and since the 70s they have gradually been substituted for Schregler boxes. Nothing was really done with bats because these nests and the broods are studied intensively through May and June, and then pretty much the birders leave and they go back the next spring to clear up. But since 1982, a gentleman called Andy Gosler, who was working on the birds, did start to notice an increasing bat occupancy in the northern half of the wood where he was doing the surveys. And so I have some records of droppings noticed or even bats noticed, and so gradually the number of boxes and also the number of incidences in his notes increase over this time, but it's not a very systematic survey. The dates are quite random, and sometimes he went in August because clearly he got too busy in June, and in August he found more bats, which is what we'd expect anyway. And then since 2002 to 2005, a gentleman called Rob Strachan, who some of you will know, was looking in the same area at some of the bats, and I started a PhD at Wild Crew and was shown these bats, and then Rob left, so it was really down to me to keep some of the surveys going. And I thought, well, right, I'm going to be really serious about this, and now it's an obsession. So since 2006, we've been ringing bats, and this is done under a license from Natural England, and another researcher from Wild Crew at the time, Fiona Matthews, holds that license. So they are bird boxes. Some of them have this domed cap, which is for the great tits, but you can see they're not very high. And some of them are even lower. This is a blue tit box, so it has even a flat roof. There is no space above, and the hole is always on the sort of top of the box, a small, even smaller hole for the blue tit boxes. And they're placed at random through the wood, on some very low, on coppice stools, some on magnificent trees where, you know, whether or not you would consider to put a bat box on such trees, I don't know. And this is how I spend my summer. Sometimes we find droppings, small amounts of droppings. Sometimes we find a lot of droppings. This is Dorbenton's droppings. It's the only species I can reliably identify just from droppings because it's very humid. And we have individual small roosts of bats. This is brown long-eared. And sometimes we find more than 30 bats. This is a Natterer's maternity roost. So to date, 80% of these boxes we've found either droppings or bats. So in these 6 years, we've just done 15,000 box checks. I was impressed until I heard Maurice's talk yesterday, and now I'm deflated, but I'll keep going. And this number is actually still increasing. Last year, it was only 75%. So but this is probably just us finding the records of the use, you know, actually getting there at the right time while there are still fresh droppings to be seen. So in terms of that, finding the number of years that we have actually recorded droppings or bats in these boxes, so some boxes are still never been used, even though we have been checking them 2 or 3 times in July to September. So they're either just not in a great location, or they're something habitat is not brilliant. The box may be low, but actually only 5% of the boxes have been used every year. Which, you know, the bats move through because there are so many boxes. They use an awful lot of the boxes, and this is droppings or bats. We're just, you know, we're looking through the late summer, and actually only about 30% of the boxes have been used in half the time. So only every other year. It's a small proportion of the boxes that's even used year on year, but there are plenty of bats. I don't have a graph of like the group size of bats, but it's this very similar picture where you have the highest density of bats. You find bats most often, and you find the most numbers of bats. It looks always a very similar picture. They pretty much stick to these edges of the wood, which are closest to water, and the centre of the wood has less occupancy. So actually the most commonly found bat is the Dorbenton's bat, and we've found them on 307 boxes, and on 472 occasions we've found a roost. And it varies from 1 or 2 individuals, and the record now is 45 in one of these boxes. So we were hearing in the previous talks, these are slightly smaller boxes, so the numbers are slightly lower. And this is a maternity group. I have seen babies born in the boxes, and they use them throughout the maternity season. And so to date, 1/4 of the boxes have had Dorbentons in them. Natterers, it's quite a similar story. 293 boxes have been confirmed for Natterers. It's harder because we don't use the droppings, and we've found them on 377 occasions. Again, this is a maternity group. The record is 39 Natterers in one box, again, slightly smaller box. But during the time when the juveniles are so small, we don't actually bring them out of the box and count them. I leave the bats I think that's a bit too much disturbance, but we don't really know. So that we don't gather information during this season, only when the juveniles are large enough to be separated from their parents as they roost, rather than being tucked up with them. So, so again, a quarter of the boxes have had natterers in to date. And overall, so the Daubenton's and the natterers are found most often. Brown long-eared is the third commonest, and it's found less frequently, and so far has been found in fewer boxes. And then we also have Pygmaeus, soprano pipistrelle, but this is really, throughout the early part of the summer, single males. And then through September, the females will start visiting, and then you have the small harems, but we don't have any maternity groups or large groups of Pygmaeus. I think maybe 5 or 6, one very fit male sometimes. And very occasionally nocturnal bats towards the end of the year again, late September. And that's they are roosting in the trees, and they are breeding in the trees. They very rarely come down into these boxes, but they're low and small. This year once we had a Leisler's, and this year once also a whiskered bat. So, but the same boxes are used by 2 or 3 species. There is some overlap even from one week to the next. They can change species, but we don't have mixed roosts. So. Comparing to Collins data, on average 3% of the checks will find some Daubenton's, and 2.5% of the checks we find some natterers. On 1% of the checks we find long-eareds or soprano pipistrelle, and very rarely anything else. So overall, that's 8% of checking we find bats. This varies quite a lot. So up in this area, it's closer to 12%. Of the checks, so 1 in 10 boxes will have bats in, and here it's much lower, only 2 or 3%. So when we're out checking, we record the box and the date, and whether there are droppings or bats. If there are bats, we put them into bags, and then we are checking the ring first for the number and also any damage, and then we are checking juveniles based on the epiphyseal joint only. So there's really a narrow window of a month and a half when they're large enough, full-grown, flying for themselves, that the ring goes on. Before, even by the end of the season, it can be very hard to tell, and we know from the ring numbers that it is impossible almost to tell. We are taking weight and forearm measurements. So using the weight and the forearm, that gives you some condition, how healthy the bat is. There was also a study, PhD has just been completed, of parasites, and finding that the parasite load is much higher in the maternity colonies than in male groups, and the parasites breed when the bats breed. It makes sense. The juveniles are often worst affected. So spinturnix mites and other mites, and then flies and fleas. And after the bats have been weighed and measured and taken from the bag and ringed, or the ring number read, we put them back in the box, and we put a stuffer, a rag, into the hole. Now, if you have a large group of bats, by the time each one has been put in, one after the other, the first ones will have spent some time getting active, and then they settle back down again. And if you put other bats in later, they will just go up and settle with their roost mates. And if you leave this for 5 minutes when the last bat goes in, we found that the bats don't fly. So there was the question of disturbance in this morning's talk, and we found that this is the way of minimising that disturbance, is to put them back one at a time and let them settle down. And then they may not use the same box the next day. They probably move. Every time I've ever been to check, which is a small number of times, they have moved. But I have sometimes found bats from one day to the next because they're moving. I try not to go back to the same area more than, I wait at least 10 days, but sometimes I go from one area to a neighbouring area, and some bats move. And so I have sometimes found bats 2 or 3 days in a row. They've moved box, but they're in boxes. So this was a natterers colony, and this was a long-eared colony. So in the boxes so far we've had 7 species: the Daubenton's, Natterers, Whiskered, brown long-eared, soprano, noctule and liselers. And from mist netting, we also, and detector records, we know there is also a healthy population of barbastels. They're found on detectors regularly and caught in mist nets, but they wouldn't use the boxes because they're cavity dwellers. They only want crevices, or flaking bark even. We have once caught a Becksteins 6 years ago. So where is Daniel? I feel for you, very similar. This was a juvenile male. Did he come from the trees and a maternity colony close by, or was he travelling through? We don't know. More survey. We hope to find more Becksteins. The common pipistrelle is present on detectors very early. There are roosts nearby, but they don't use the boxes. I don't know if that's... They're all pygmaeus in the boxes, so that's a mystery. Brants and also Nethusius nearby, but they don't seem to be choosing these boxes. So with the ringing study, we have ringed now nearly 1,500 Daubentons, 600 Natterers and 500 long-eareds. And the recapture rate is quite high, even in the Daubentons, 45%, 67% in the Natterers, and 44% in the long-eared. So this is just showing you the number of individuals in the darker colours, and then the recapture information is in the paler colours. So in the Natterers, we have a lot of information now from recaptures. So it's 2,500 occasions, and the majority of that is now recapturing bats, whereas with the Daubentons we still have half of the bats we've only seen once, and there's just a high turnover, and I'll also go on to explain one of the reasons for that. So this is 2,683 individuals, and they've been seen. We have 6,500 records nearly, and the majority of that is recaptured bats. So this is a yearly pattern. The number of individuals we've ringed is increasing in both cases. So it's new individuals every year, but also recaptured individuals. So this is the recapture information. And again, getting good information from small numbers of Natterers, whereas the Daubentons, it's often the same ones. This is running low on battery now. And this is the number of Daubentons and Natterers ringed as adults or juveniles. So you can see that in the Daubentons, we ringed a lot of adults for 2 years, and that now the number of adults is slowly decreasing, but we still find a lot of adults. Whereas in the Natterers, almost in the first year of intensive survey effort, we ringed a lot of adults and then hardly adults at all. And the juveniles, there was a real peak in 2011. There's been a steady increase in survey effort, but also we've got cleverer in when to go and where to go exactly. So that's why we're finding more individuals. Between 2011 and 2012, this is pretty much equivalent survey effort. And we've had a lot fewer juveniles to ring this year simply because there were a lot less juveniles this year. 2011 was a very good year. So this is establishing some kind of baseline. These earlier records aren't really, scientifically equivalent. So it will be interesting to see as time goes on, climate change, the extremes of weather, just exactly to get a measurable difference like this in the number of juveniles found and making it through. So one of the differences in recapture rate between the species is the fact that the Daubentons in the woodland, it's 2 to 1 male to female. So we have twice as many males as females in the Daubentons. And in the Natterers, it's exactly the opposite. We have twice as many females as males in the boxes. So while we find maternity colonies of both, and the maternity colonies we find regularly, males are found less often with the maternity groups. Only once the juveniles are fairly well grown do the males come in. And with the Daubentons, there are large, up to 30 bats, 30 males in a bachelor group in a box. There's a whole separate male population that uses the boxes as well, whereas the Natterers, we find the males either in very small groups or with the females. The juveniles is closer to 1 to 1, which is what you would expect. And in terms of recapture rates, this is recaptures from 1 year to the next, or between years. From the year it's ringed, do we find it in subsequent years? And the adult females is the highest recapture rate of any of the measures. The males we see less often, including the Daubenton's males, but there are just a lot of them cycling through the boxes, it seems. And we have a higher recapture rate of juvenile females than juvenile males. But interestingly, all the juvenile females have been found in their maternity groups when they're found, but also the juvenile males have stayed with their maternity groups, or they join the large male population of Daubenton's. So there's been no dispersal recorded from one group to another within the wood. Using those ring numbers, we're now working out different social groups across the wood. So this is showing 7 different groups of natterers, maternity colonies, and also males that have been found frequently with females. They are loyal to one female maternity group. So occasionally you find small groups of males in random areas, but we haven't ever found males associating with more than one female group. And each of these colours is ringed bats. There's a core of bats in this group, in these groups of 20 to 30 individuals that have been seen at least 5 times with one other bat in that core. And the total group of bats that we don't see so often, there's up to 100 or 130 individuals that we've found so far in these groups. And then I haven't had time yet to analyse this year's data to add it to the Daubenton social groups, but this is females only. There are, again, up to 7 different colonies. This colony mostly uses an outlier of the woodland, a small area very close by. And the males move between lots of female colonies. The males have their own social network, but they visit lots of the females and also stay in male groups, so it's much more complicated. So this is female only. So for long-term monitoring, we would like to keep this going with the recaptures because we can find out, survivorship, the life history of these individuals, and also their health, because you saw there was a decline in juvenile numbers this year, but also the ringing date. Usually I can ring in the middle of July. This year I didn't put any rings onto juveniles till the middle of August because they were so slow developing or born late. And also, this year's bats have a smaller forearm than juveniles from previous years. So it's that 3 weeks when they're growing fixes the size of the bat for the rest of its life. So you can then look at whether or not each cohort, yearly cohort, is healthy or not. And we still need better resolution from recaptures for the social groups, and it would obviously be very interesting to get DNA analysis to understand whether the social group is related to maternal lines, but also from bats of known age, the breeding success of different individuals. And then there is also the question of box use versus tree roosts. Going round the boxes, the bats aren't always in the boxes. From a limited amount of radio tracking, about 8 individuals, we have seen 50-50 box versus tree use. So even though there are this many boxes, they are also using the trees in the woodland. And it would also be interesting, now that we have these territories of where bats are choosing to roost, and there is very little overlap between the different social groups in terms of where they're roosting. How does this relate to foraging territory, where the bats go in the night? So telemetry would be interesting, and we have some plans to do this. Also, because in May and June, these boxes are mostly used by birds, in May, and I'm hoping to do radio tracking to find out exactly where the bats are when they're not using the boxes. But this, of course, involves funding. So, so far this, yes, so far this has been done as a voluntary project, and it's most efficient for me to be there in the daytime. I find most bats in boxes, so there's been a limited amount of netting or radio tracking I can't do everything. But there is, of course, lots of people who help me. So this is thank you to everybody and for the photographs. 40 to 60 people have come, some very regularly. It's great. So thank you.